So in today's class, we shall be starting with collective bargaining. Now, what do you mean by collective bargaining? Let us understand. One of the many purposes of this theory of wages is to analyze the effect of collective bargaining on wages. In modern labor economics, collective bargaining has assumed a pride of place. Workers nowadays combine and form a trade union to press collectively on their employer for higher wages. Many times such pressure becomes effective, but in certain circumstances it proves harmful to the workers. Whether a demand for higher wages through collective bargaining would be added to by the employer or not depends upon the conditions prevailing in the factor market and the product market. So, in collective bargaining, if all the workers come together and tell the employee that they want higher wages, in that case, in certain cases, it may happen that he shall accept their demand, and in certain cases, it shall happen that he shall directly say that no, I am not going to do it, and he shall say that if you don't want, you can leave the organization. So it depends upon the demand of the factors, and it also depends upon the employer how many labor he has available and what are the situation. Conceptually, the following four circumstances of collective bargaining may arise. It is assumed throughout the analysis of collective bargaining that the trade union will demand a higher but equal wage to each of its members. When both the product market and labor market are perfectly competitive. So in the circumstances where trade union demand a higher but equal to each of its members, the trade union would not be benefited, pressurizing on employees. This is because higher wages are associated with some degree of unemployment. So when both the product market and the labor market are perfectly competitive, means what? That both are equal to each other, and in this case the trade union would not be having the benefit even if he pressurizes the employer, because higher wages are associated with some degree of unemployment also. When the product market is monopolistic and the labor market is monosonistic, this means that the buyer of the labor as well as the seller of the product is one firm only. Since the firm is monopolistic, its demand curve or MRP curve would be steeper, and at the same time the supply curve of labor MW would be rising upwards, because it is monosonistic. Thus a pressure on the entrepreneurs by his laborers for rising wages by means of collective bargaining will be favorably responded to by the firm. There will be twofold benefit in this process. One, the wage would be rising, and the other, more workers would be employed. That is, the firm would need more workers to maximize its profit. So, when the product market is monopolistic and the labor market is monosonistic, so we have already studied about these two markets in the earlier part of this chapter. So, what will happen is that the firm is having a monopolistic demand curve, that is MRP curve, which we had studied earlier, and a pressure on the entrepreneurs by his laborers for rising wages by means of collective bargaining will be favorably responded to by the firm. So this will be the effect of monopolistic market and the perfect competition. When the product market is perfectly competitive but the labor market is monosonistic, this type of situation yields similar results as the monopolistic and monosonistic situation. In other words, the workers will be successful to obtain higher wages subject to the maximum equal to their MRP. In case the workers organization is unwise enough to press for wages higher the MRP, it will have to face unemployment. So in case if the employer is not ready to pay to the laborers the wages which they require, in that case the situation may arise that there will be unemployment, because people will leave the organization. When the product market is monosonistic but the labor market is perfectly competitive, here collective bargaining is hard to get higher wages without same amount of unemployment. Of course, the workers who are being paid somewhat less than productivities will now be able to earn wages equivalent to their marginal revenue productivities. Wages with no unemployment can increase only if MRP increases so as to offset the likely unemployment. So, when the product market is monosonistic but the labor market is perfectly competitive, in that case, higher wages without same amount of unemployment will take place. And in this case, workers who are being paid somewhat less than their marginal revenue productivities, they will earn higher wages in this equivalent. So, trade unions and wage determination. Establishment of a strong trade union introduces an element of monopoly in the market, in the labor market. Instead of each worker negotiating with the employer on the question of wages, the trade union bargains on behalf of all them all. For a long time, economists held the view that the trade union action in increasing wages was futile and ineffective. The classical economists argued that wages would be raised only at the expense of profits and a fall in profits by reducing industrial activity would reduce demand for labor and cause unemployment. But modern economists do not subscribe to the above view. They strongly hold that trade unions can raise wages in a number of ways. Stopping exploitation. The trade unions can ensure that labor is paid the full value of its marginal productivity. Competition in the real world is not perfect, hence wages do not come up to the marginal productivity level due to weak bargaining power of labor. By improving their bargaining power, the trade unions can raise wages up to the marginal productivity level and put an end to the exploitation of labor by powerful employers. Rising marginal productivity. Trade unions can improve the marginal productivity of labor itself. They can force the employer to use more up-to-date appliances and organization. They improve the efficiency of labor itself. Trade unions may also increase the marginal productivity of a particular group of laborers by restricting its supply. So firstly, stopping exploitation means what? That the trade unions will see to it that the laborers are paid enough and they are not exploited by the employer. Then second is marginal productivity, rising marginal productivity. If the laborers are paid well, if all the conditions are taken into consideration, in that case, there will be a rising marginal productivity, and also the production of the organization will also increase with the time. Restricting labor supply. The trade unions usually adopt a number of restrictive devices. Example, forcing the government to pass immigration laws, pressing for the reduction of working hours, restricting entry to the union, and not permitting non-union laborers to work, etc. The aim clearly is to raise wages by reducing supply of labor when demand for it remains the same. There are special circumstances in which a particular set of workers can raise their wages by withdrawing their supply. When the demand for a group of labor is inelastic, when the wages of the said group form a small proportion of the total cost of production of the commodity concerned, and when the other factors of production are squeezable. So now restricting labor supply. If the trade unions adopt to restrict the labor supply, in that case there will be a lot of issue concerning with the wages, and also with the reducing labor supply will create a less of production, and also the demand for it will keep on rising. If the demand rises, the cost also will increase. Rising standard wage rate. Instead of putting restriction on supply of labor, modern trade unions fighting for the raising of standard wage rate. Once certain wage rates are accepted by a representative body of the industry, individual firms quickly fall in line. So, raising the standard wage rate means what? Instead of putting restriction on the supply of labor, modern trade unions fight to rise the standard wages. Increasing labor demand. The trade unions also adopt ways and means to increase the demand for labor on the part of the employees. So, increasing labor demand. As the demand will increase automatically, the payments and the wages for the laborers will also have to be increased. The unions try to shift the derived demand curve upward for instance, by improving labor productivity, they may enable the management to reduce the cost of production and hence the price. This in turn will increase the demand. The unions may agitate for the protection of the industry so that the domestic industry expands and employs more labor. They may influence the government to pay higher rates on public contracts for the goods made by the industry. They may help the employers to charge a higher monopoly price and wrest a share for labor out of monopoly profits. Some unions have agitated for higher tariff in order to increase the domestic demand for goods they produce and consequently for labor used in their production. Trade unions can raise wages because a large part of this rise can come about by squeezing the rent element in the factors of production and monopoly gains in other incomes. Lastly, the raising of wages by the unions will not necessarily discourage investment today. The bulk of investment comes out from individuals, but comes out not from individuals but from big corporations, which usually maintain the level of investment but reduce dividend to shareholders where their income falls. So this was about collective bargaining, how collective bargaining and how trade unions help the laborers to increase their wages and to get proper amount for themselves. Now next we have the next concept is interest. Now what do you mean by interest? Interest is return which is gained on either on capital or on some kind of investment. Meaning, interest has been most controversial topic in the whole theory of distribution. Economists have differed regarding the nature of interest as well as how it is determined. Interest is a payment for the use of capital. According to Marshall, interest is the price paid for the use of capital in any market. Interest is expressed as a percentage return on capital invested for allowing for the risk of investment. Net interest and gross interest. Net interest is the reward paid to capitalists for the use of capital only. In other words, net interest is the payment made purely for use of capital. Marshall defined net interest as earning of capital simply as the reward for waiting. Our analysis is concerned with net interest or pure interest only. So what do you mean by interest? Interest is the amount that is paid for the use of capital in the market. Now let us understand net interest and gross interest. In net interest, Marshall has defined net interest as a earning of capital, simply the reward for waiting, and our analysis is concerned with net interest or pure interest only. Then next we have gross interest, is the amount paid by a borrower to a lender as written on capital borrowed. Gross interest includes some charges other than the net interest. Besides the price for the use of capital, gross interest also includes reward for risk of lending money, the return for inconvenience, return for management of loan, etc. Gross interest consists of the following components. Net interest, this includes the price for the use of capital alone. A reward for risk taking. When interest is charged besides the price for the use of capital, the lender also includes the return for taking risk. If risk is more, rate of interest will be higher than the price for use of capital and vice versa. The reward for management, a lender has to keep all the accounts of his lending business. The expenditure that he incurs on managing the accounts is added to the interest that he charges from the borrower. Reward for inconveniences. When a lender charges interest, he includes in it the price of all inconveniences involved in recovery of the loans. Therefore, gross interest is equal to net interest plus return for risk plus return for inconvenience plus return for management of loan. So, we can conclude from here that gross interest is firstly net interest, then the second is return for risk. Because the person who has invested his capital, he has taken a risk. Then third is return for inconvenience. Then next is return for management of loan. Next is concept of capital saving and investment. To understand the concepts of capital saving and investment, it would be appropriate to study the classical and or real theory of interest, which seeks to explain the determination of the rate of interest by real factors, that is, productivity of capital goods and saving of goods. According to this theory, rate of interest is determined by the demand for savings to invest in capital goods and to supply of savings. Demand for savings. The demand for capital goods comes from firms which desire to invest, that is, to purchase or to make new capital goods. Capital goods are demanded because they can be used to produce consumer goods, because they have revenue productivity like all other factors. For any given type of capital asset, example a machinery, it is possible to draw a marginal revenue productivity curve showing the addition made to the total revenue by an additional unit of a machine at various levels of the stock of that machine. But the marginal revenue productivity of capital is a more complex concept than that of other factors. The entrepreneurs have to take into consideration the uncertainties of the future and estimate the percentage yield or returns from capital after making allowance for maintenance and operating costs. That is, they have to find out the net expected return of a marginal unit of capital expressed as percentage of the cost of the capital asset. The more capital assets of a given kind and an entrepreneur has, the less revenue or income he will expect to earn by purchasing one or more machine of the same kind. Therefore, the marginal revenue productivity curve of capital slopes downwards towards the right as shown below. So this is the amount of capital which is invested and the rate of net return on capital. So this diagram shows that there is the slope downwards towards the right. So this was about the capital curve which shall be taken into consideration. Now let us understand the explanation regarding the same. In the above figure 4.70, at OR rate of interest OM, if the amount of capital is demanded. This is because only at OM amount of capital the falling net rate of return on capital becomes equal to the prevailing rate of interest. Or if the rate of interest falls from OR to OR1, the amount of capital demanded will increase and OM to OM1. Thus, the MRP curve of capital shows the demand for capital or demand for savings to buy the capital, which slopes downwards towards the right. Thus, it is true of individual firms, industries, and of community as a whole. Demand for capital goods will increase as rate of interest falls. So, with this curve, we can draw a conclusion that when capital goods will increase, the rate of interest will fall. Now, supply of savings. The money which is to be used for purchasing capital goods is made available by those who save from their current income. By postponing consumption of a part of their current income, they release resources for productive purposes. Savings involve the element of waiting for the future enjoyment of savings. More savings the people do, the more consumption they will have to postpone. Thus, to induce people to save more, higher rates of interest must be afforded. Hence supply curve of capital will slope upwards to the right. Now, equilibrium between demand and supply. The rate of interest is determined by the interaction of the forces of demand for capital or investment and the supply of savings. This is illustrated as follows. In the above figure 4.80, SS is the supply curve and savings and II is the demand curve of savings to invest in capital goods. The two curves intersect each other at point OR. Rate of interest and when OM amount is the money is lent, borrowed and invest. So the above figure explains us how the demand and supply of will affect the capital curve. Then next we have loanable funds theory of interest. This is also called a neoclassical theory of interest. It asserts that rate of interest is determined by the equilibrium between demand and supply of loanable funds in the credit market. Hence, interest is the price paid for the use of loanable funds. Supply of loanable funds. This is derived from four basic sources. First is savings. Savings by individuals or household constitute the most important source of loanable funds. Savings are looked at in either of the two ways as ex ante savings, that is savings planned by individuals at the beginning of the period in the hope of expected incomes and anticipated expenditures on consumption. Savings as the difference between the income of the preceding period and the consumption of the present period. Savings primarily depend upon the size of incomes, but given the level of income, savings vary at various rates of interest. Dishoarding. Individuals may dishoard money from the hoarded stock of the previous period. Thus, cash balances lying idle in the previous period become active balances in the present period. At higher rate of interest, more will be dishoarded. Now, for this we have first is savings. So, for a person to invest capital, he will use his savings, or if he is providing a loan, he is using his savings. Then, in case he has hoarded, that is from the last year's funds, he has been utilizing it for this year, this will be dishoarding. Then next we have bank credit. Banks, by creating money, can advance loans to businessmen. This adds to the supply of loan funds. Banks can also reduce the amount of money by contracting their lending. Generally speaking, banks will lend more money at higher rates of interest than at lower ones, other things remaining the same. So, bank credit means creating advance loans to businessmen, and this will add to the supply of loan funds. Then next we have disinvestment. This is the opposite of investment and takes place when due to structural changes or bad venture, the existing stock of machines and other equipment is allowed to wear out without being replaced, or when inventories are drawn below the level of the previous period. This investment is encouraged by a high rate of interest on loanable funds. The lateral summation of the savings, dishoarding, disinvestment and bank credit results in a total supply curve of loanable funds, which slopes upwards to the right, showing that a greater amount of loanable funds will be available at higher rates of interest and vice versa. So, in case bank credit is taken, it means the businesses are given, or the businessmen or employers are given loans on credit. Then, disinvestment means the opposite of investment. It means that it takes place when the due structural changes or bad venture existing stock or machinery is allowed to wear out without being replaced. So, we will start with demand for loanable loans in the next class.